Hello, everyone. This is Afrometrics research-based news covering the major news events with a research base across the Black world in the past week. There's several topics that we're going to be talking about this time, and they won't take up too much of your time. I promise we'll be discussing gaps in special education identification, the representation of Black workers at the Federal Reserve and the largest companies in Britain, the concept of a black tax in South Africa, the pre-Columbian Afro-Mexican presence, Black college student stress management strategies, and the experiences of Black workers in Silicon Valley. Very exciting studies that came out, and we'll just be highlighting a few of them. First, Michigan State has released a new research study and the results on racial gaps in special education identification. According to Michigan State University, their researchers have found that Black and Latinx students are over-identified as having disabilities in schools with small percentages of non-white students, but they're under-identified as having disabilities in schools with large percentages of non-white students. For more information about this, please look for it in the Journal of Labor Economics. Another very interesting study that came out, the Federal Reserve System is often called the Fed. You hear this language of the Fed being used in Washington, and it includes the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and also 12 regional banks. So although the Fed has been publicly espousing diversity and inclusion as of late, a new analysis by New York Times has reported that Black economists are underrepresented at the Fed. And according to the report, Black people are less represented within the Fed than in the field of economics as a whole. Only 2 of the 417 economists, or 0.5%, on staff at the Fed's board in Washington were Black, as of the data that the Fed provided last month. Black people make up 13% of the U.S. population and 3 to 4% of U.S. citizens and permanent residents who graduate as PhDs in economics as of last year's data. So the report goes on to say that across the board in the Fed's system of 12 regional banks, 1.3% of economists identified as Black alone, and that aggregate figure masks some degree of variation. So 5 of the banks lacked a single economist who identified as only Black, and people who identified as 2 or more races, of whom there were 6 in the Fed's whole system, were not included in the count since their racial identity was not specified. So this means that Black people are underrepresented in policymaking circles at the Fed. However, it is important to note that President Biden has pledged to push the Fed to diversify and has also advocated for the Federal Reserve Act so that policymakers can focus more on gaps in racial economic outcomes, including wages, jobs, and wealth. Another very interesting study came out in Britain, and it was focused on a very similar issue. A new report was released in Britain by Green Park, which is an executive recruitment and consultancy firm that's chaired by Trevor Phillips. The report found that the number of Black people holding the role of chairman, chief executive, or finance chief at the FTSE 100 companies, which are the biggest companies in Britain, is now 0. So the number of Black people holding the role of chairman, chief executive, or finance chief is at 0, according to Phillips. And Phillips also said that business leaders have to understand nobody cares how much they care. It doesn't matter. What matters is what they do. So people are continuing to put pressure on companies to go beyond the rhetoric of equity, inclusion, and diversity. And that seems to be something that is happening globally. A new study was also published about the concept of a South African black tax. This was quite interesting, and it was published in the Journal of Economic and Financial Sciences by Riley Carpenter. and Malilimalo Paswana. And they defined this concept of a black tax as a cost that's paid by black South Africans due to their cultural responsibility. And unlike their white fellow citizens, they have to take up a financial burden because they have to pay and transfer money and other goods to support their relatives, their indirect and direct family members. And the authors of the paper discuss how the South African government can create taxation legislation that provides for and supports this black tax, which is a level of financial responsibility that their non-black peers often don't have to assume for economic and cultural reasons. Another very interesting study came out. A new research paper was published in the Journal of African Studies by Festus Chibuike Onwegbu. Onwegbu investigated the physical and cultural presence of African people in Mexico in the pre-Columbian era. So Onwegbu discusses new evidence that Africans had maintained contacts with people around the coast of Mexico years before Europeans came in contact with the Americas, and in that right made important contributions to the rise of Meso-American civilization. So this new evidence presented in this article, and remember that it is in the Journal of African Studies. In addition, a new study was published in the Journal of Qualitative Research Reports and Communication by Wei Sun, who is the author. And this study investigates African American students' perceived stress and stress management strategies at an HBCU. The students who participated in this study were 14 African American students from an HBCU, which the name of is confidential. So according to the student participants, the main sources of their stress were financial aid, schoolwork, and their future careers. The mechanism that they reported using to manage their stress included one, self-reliance, and two, talking to friends primarily. So students reported feeling comfortable talking about their stress with family and friends, while others reported that they tend to close themselves off from family and peers when they are feeling depressed, which can be significantly more damaging. So ultimately, this kind of research is important, especially for advocacy for more campus resources, such as hiring more counselors and offering more classes to teach students how to reduce stress or stress reduction strategies. Another very interesting study, in the Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies, it features a new article by Rebecca Franklin on the experiences of Black workers in Silicon Valley. So Franklin investigates how Black workers go about forming collegial relationships between themselves and their non-Black counterparts, as well as the barriers that they face and how those relationships are pivotal to their job advancement. A major issue in Silicon Valley is Black people being left out of social networks and professional in circles that tend to be related to their likelihood of advancing or experiencing job advancement. So Franklin explains how Black workers in Silicon Valley are underrepresented, constituting only 2% of the workforce in many of the top firms, but also how they're often kept out of white and Asian social networks. They also form their own small group based on shared identity, like, for example, small groups based on shared ethnic identity, like with other Black workers or non-white workers. They also sometimes form collegial social networks across racial boundaries. However, what Franklin points out in this study is that the burden often falls on Black workers to make their white and Asian colleagues feel at ease and to reach across ethnicity to find commonality and form those social networks. Ultimately, the study highlights the struggles for social and professional inclusion faced by Black workers in Silicon Valley. That's all for this week, everybody. This has been an Afrometrics research-based news brief. You can visit us at afrometrics.org and see you all next week. Thank you very much.